Greetings. My name is Peter McCormick, and I'm here to talk about one of the most misrepresented persons in maritime history, Lieutenant William Bligh of the Royal Navy. When I wrote an autobiography, I surprised my friends by identifying William Bligh as one of my heroes, along with Admiral Lord Nelson, Sir Ernest Shackleton, Captain James Cook, and Winston Churchill, all great leaders. How could this possibly be the case? Everyone knows that Bligh was a vicious tyrant who enjoyed flogging his crew and depriving dying men of water. How do we know this? Well, because we read the book, Mutiny on the Bounty, by Nordhoff and Hall, or we went to several versions of the movies made by Hollywood. But of course, we were all wrong. Sadly, Bligh is an early example of a victim of the media, an innocent man who was tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. Some would say that there was no mutiny on the Bounty. There was simply a revolt of one man against another man, Christian against Bligh. And there's some truth to that. But let's start at the beginning. Bligh was born in 1754 near Plymouth, England, where his father was a customs officer. And at the time of the mutiny in 1789, Bligh was 34 years old. His parents had enlisted him in the Royal Navy at age 7 as captain's servant in HMS Monmouth, although he never actually went to sea, which was a common practice at the time to gain a head start on seniority. But he was 16 before he first went to sea in HMS Hunter as an able seaman, subsequently becoming a midshipman. He worked hard and successfully to acquire the skills essential for an officer of the Royal Navy. The most important event of his youth was that by 1776, at age 22, his navigation skills attracted the attention of Captain James Cook, who selected him to be sailing master of HMS Resolution for Cook's third and final voyage to the Pacific. The term master did not mean commanding officer. Sailing master was a non-commissioned officer responsible for the safe navigation of the vessel. This period of serving Captain Cook, who was recognized as England's most brilliant navigator, allowed Bligh to further polish his already excellent navigation skills. Bligh was right there at Kealakekua Bay on the west coast of Hawaii when the natives murdered Captain Cook. And after the murder, Bligh stepped up to navigate Resolution back to England. What Bligh learned of the Western Pacific and remembered from his time with Cook 12 years earlier would prove a crucial resource after the mutiny and during the voyage of the Bounty launch. So, what was the reason for the Bounty's 1787 voyage in the first place? Why, to increase profits, of course. What else is new? By the 1770s, the British sugar plantations in the West Indies were long established, worked by a large force of African slaves. Those slaves had to be fed, and plantation owners were looking for a cheaper way to feed them. Early explorers of the Pacific had found a nutritious and plentiful food called breadfruit, and no less a personage than Sir Joseph Banks, head of the Royal Society, suggested that the breadfruit might be the solution they were looking for. So the Admiralty was directed to sponsor the first commercial voyage to the Pacific to collect breadfruit plants from Tahiti and transplant them to the West Indies. I would argue that the Admiralty laid all the foundations for the mutiny long before Bligh ever set sail. First, they wanted to do the job on the cheap, so they chose a single unaccompanied vessel that was small for the job. And this vessel was then modified so that 1/3 of its space was devoted to the future storage of the breadfruit plants, leaving the 45 officers and men living cheek by jowl in very cramped quarters for the long voyage of 10 months and 27,000 miles to Tahiti. Second, the Admiralty could have promoted Bligh from lieutenant to captain, but refused to do so because it was standard policy for a vessel of that small size to be commanded by a lieutenant. Remember that the word captain is subject to two definitions. First, as a rank in the hierarchy of the Royal Navy, meaning the number of stripes on your uniform. And second, as a general term, referring to the commanding officer of any ship. So, Captain Bligh of the Bounty was in fact Lieutenant Bligh. Third, if the commanding officer of a ship was a captain in rank, he was allowed a commissioned officer as a second in command. But as a lieutenant, Bligh was denied a second officer, so he had no backup. This had major implications when Bligh later appointed Fletcher Christian as acting lieutenant, which proved a major factor in the mutiny. Fourth, it was standard Admiralty practice to provide a captain in rank with protection in the form of a contingent of Marines to serve as a buffer, living between the officers and the crew. But as a lieutenant, Bligh was also denied that protection. If the Marines had been provided, I believe the mutiny would never have occurred. Fifth, again, because of the small size of the ship, the Admiralty failed to provide a purser, forcing Bligh to accept the additional role of responsibility for all supplies for the ship, which is a major paperwork job and heavy with accountability. Sixth, the Admiralty at the time was a monument to bureaucracy, and for reasons unknown to me, they failed to grant Bligh and his all-volunteer crew of 45 permission to sail until December 18, 1787, many weeks after he was ready for sea. Whatever the cause, this delay created several major problems. First, it meant they arrived at Cape Horn in a season of powerful headwinds, which, after 31 days of battling extreme foul weather, prevented them from rounding the Horn and approaching Tahiti from the east as planned. The inability to round the Horn meant that they had to reverse course and approach Tahiti from the west, via Africa's Cape of Good Hope, then south of Australia and New Zealand, which added many weeks to the trip. The aggregate of these delays meant that they arrived in Tahiti too late in the season for transplanting the breadfruit. The need to remain in Tahiti for 6 long months, waiting for the next transplant period, became a huge contributor to the mutiny. In a nutshell, the crew fell in love with Tahiti, with its easygoing women, and with a lifestyle which they found far more attractive than life in England. For months, the harsh conditions and rigid shipboard discipline of the Royal Navy melted under the warm sun and gentle breezes of Tahiti, and the men would not relish returning to shipboard discipline. But the good times came to an end when the breadfruit was finally loaded and the ship got underway for the West Indies. Because of all the fruits and vegetables eaten while there, the men left Tahiti in excellent physical condition, probably the best in the Royal Navy. But the combination of leaving behind their informal native wives and idyllic lifestyle, and the need to immediately reestablish Royal Navy discipline, drove crew morale to an all-time low. So let's focus now on the personalities of the 3 key players of the mutiny: William Bligh, John Fryer, and Fletcher Christian. If any one of them had been missing, there would probably have been no mutiny. William Bligh was a man of modest background, for whom the Royal Navy offered a path to a respectable social status. And throughout his life, Bligh held a very high opinion of himself and jealously guarded his social and military standing. Bligh suffered from some form of paranoia. He felt there were enemies who were always trying to pull him down. One writer described Bligh as a humane and considerate commander who followed the precepts of Captain Cook, but he was not a sensitive or perceptive man. Although he was a first-class naval officer, Bligh's human relations skills left a lot to be desired. He was, however, totally dedicated to his profession and held himself to extremely high standards. Unfortunately, he applied those same standards to all of his associates, and when their performance fell short of his expectations, he had a quick and passionate temper and was prone to publicly criticize and humiliate those working for him. And although he often later apologized for his outbursts. So it was not the cat of nine tails that inflicted the greatest pain on his men, but the sting of public verbal insults and criticism. Praise for a job well done was rare. People working for Bligh felt underappreciated. Bligh is often portrayed as delighting in subjecting sailors to painful lashings with the cat o' nine tails. This is absolutely untrue. His record of floggings was substantially lower than most Royal Navy captains of the time. In fact, some have said that Bligh used the lash not too much, but too little. Knowledge of disease was still rudimentary, but Bligh made every effort to provide his crew with fresh fruit and vegetables to prevent the disease of scurvy, and he insisted on the highest standards of cleanliness throughout the ship and for the men's clothing. He even hired a blind fiddler to play for the crew to dance evenings on deck for exercise. When a ship crossed the equator, it was traditional for King Neptune to hold initiation ceremonies, which could be pretty rough, one of which was to drag a man overboard on the end of a rope from the yardarm until he feared he would drown. Bligh regarded this as inhumane and forbid the practice. During the terrible month of trying to beat to windward around Cape Horn, Bligh kept a fire going all the time for the purpose of warming the men and drying their wet clothes, and he issued extra rations of rum and provided a hot breakfast. He even allowed crew members whose quarters were leaking and wet to occupy his own cabin. Once they gave up upon Cape Horn and headed for Cape Town, he called the crew together and thanked them for their great efforts. This is not the record of a man who liked to abuse his crew. The second major player in the mutiny, whom nobody remembers, was John Fryer, who was the sailing master, meaning navigator, which, in the absence of other officers, would have made him second in command. He was 35 years old and unlikely to advance further. His navigation skills were satisfactory, middle-of-the-road skills, but far beneath the skills of Bligh. So, in fact, the role of master in the Bounty was superfluous. Fryer always believed that he was every bit as good as Bligh, but he was certainly not. Our third key player, of course, was Fletcher Christian, who signed on as master's mate, the assistant to John Fryer. Sadly, there is no known portrait of Christian, so we have no idea what he really looked like, except that he had a dark complexion and was slightly bow-legged. He had sailed several merchant voyages with Bligh, and they were friends. The seeds of conflict were sown when Bligh decided to make life easier for his crew by putting the ship on a 3-watch system, meaning 4 hours on, 8 hours off, rather than the 2-watch system of 4 hours on and 4 hours off, which provided so little sleep. This meant that in addition to himself and Mr. Fryer, Bligh needed a third watch officer, and so he appointed Christian as acting lieutenant, which jumped him over and above John Fryer, who naturally was enraged and resentful. In revenge, Fryer thereafter dedicated himself to undermining both Bligh and Christian at every possible opportunity. Fryer was a first-class troublemaker. During the time in Tahiti, Christian had become indolent and lax in attention to his officer duties. Once the ship was underway again, Bligh found Christian sloppy in his duties and did not hesitate to criticize him publicly. Christian felt humiliated and began nurturing a plan to escape the ship on a raft and try to remain in the islands. Before the plan was realized, it dawned on him that he wouldn't need to leave the ship if Bligh was gone instead. So the mutiny began to take shape. Keep in mind the political environment of the time. The rebellion in America had only recently come to a close 6 years earlier, and inspired by people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, waves of revolutionary thinking were washing across Europe, which would shortly lead to the French Revolution, which in turn sent spasms of fear through the British monarchy. On the Bounty, the mutiny was finally triggered by the fact that Bligh had acquired a pile of coconuts for his own use. And one night, during his watch on deck, Christian ate one, causing Bligh to publicly call him a thief. Bligh had frequently criticized Christian, but this humiliation pushed Christian over the edge. And while Bligh slept, on April 28, 1789, Christian, aged 25, led 3 men, armed with cutlasses, into Bligh's cabin. This image is the original first account of the mutiny, written in Bligh's own hand. It says, "Just before sunrise, Mr. Christian, mate, Charles Churchill, ship's corporal, John Mills, gunner's mate, and Thomas Burkett, seaman, came into my cabin while I was asleep, and seizing me, tied my hands with a cord behind my back, and threatened me with instant death if I spoke or made the least noise." Bligh was forced on deck in his nightshirt, and Christian was determined to set him adrift in a small open boat. While unforeseen at the time, Christian's actions would ultimately result in the death of 71 individuals, including Christian's own murder on Pitcairn, before the whole affair played out. The crew, now numbering 43, divided into 2 factions. 20 of the crew were armed mutineers, while 23 unarmed men chose to remain loyal to Bligh. The 23-foot launch was lowered, and Bligh and his loyalists were forced into it. It became very clear that the launch could not hold 23 men plus Bligh. So 4 loyalists were forced to climb back aboard Bounty against their wishes, leaving a total of 19 in the boat plus Bligh. The boat was still heavily overloaded, with just 7 inches freeboard between the water and the rail of the open boat. Christian refused to provide them any firearms, but did throw a couple of cutlasses into the boat. Bligh was given his Navy commission, his logbook, some purse's inventories, a compass, and a sextant, but no charts and no chronometer. For food, they were given what might be considered provisions for 5 days. 150 pounds of bread, meaning hardtack, 16 pieces of pork, 6 quarts of rum, 6 bottles of wine, and 28 gallons of water. After the launch had been cast loose, the mutineers promptly set about, throwing more than 1,000 breadfruit trees overboard, leaving a trail of floating plants in their wake. Christian and the mutineers probably assumed that Bligh would head for one of the Tongan islands, where they could live until found by a passing ship. But Bligh's first move was to land on the nearby island of Tofoa, within sight of the Bounty, in hopes of obtaining additional food. He found 20 coconuts, but the natives were unfriendly, and once they realized that the men had no guns, they attacked and stoned one man to death. The crew were bombarded by a hail of stones, and they and Bligh were very lucky to escape alive. But the launch was now down to 19, 18 crew plus Bligh. This experience convinced Bligh to never again go ashore on an island inhabited by unknown natives. And thus began a voyage of 48 days and 3,618 nautical miles. A voyage which, by any rational standards, was clearly impossible. The 23-foot open launch they occupied was in fact an excellent boat, but one which, laughingly, would not be considered seaworthy by the U.S. Coast Guard. Although the boat was severely overloaded, it was in the hands of Bligh, who was a highly skilled seaman. This is a modern replica. Their survival now depended on three things, each of which was highly unlikely. First, the ability to keep the boat afloat with only 7 inches of freeboard. Second, the ability to find their way without charts to the Dutch settlement of Kupang at Timor, Indonesia, 3,500 miles away. And third, the ability to avoid starving to death. 3 seemingly insurmountable challenges. During the first 3 weeks, the launch experienced bad weather, with strong winds, rough seas, and heavy rain. Despite diligent helmsmanship, waves were constantly coming over the rails, threatening to swamp the boat, and the crew was forced to frantically bail both seawater and rainwater. The rain was a two-edged sword. It provided them with an adequate supply of fresh water, but it was also cold, leaving the crew shivering in the wind in their soaking wet shirts, close to hypothermia during the long nights. Living conditions in the boat were absolutely torturous. There was no room for 19 people. Everyone was in everyone's way. Even bailing out water required men to shift their feet. There was no space to lie down, and men were forced to lean against the inside of the hull, comprised of an endless geography of sharp wooden right angles, which painfully pushed on the skin to the bone. Sleep was basically impossible and consisted mostly of falling into insensibility. It would be bad enough for a day or two, but for 48 days, this was the voyage from hell. It would be hard to exaggerate the level of physical discomfort these men were suffering. The wind kept them moving since the launch had 2 masts setting small sails, and in fact, the launch averaged a remarkably good speed of about 4 miles an hour over the entire trip. But which way to go, surrounded by an empty horizon in every direction? Here is where Bligh's brilliance came to the rescue. Since he had no charts, he was forced to visualize from memory the charts he knew from his voyage with Captain Cook 12 years earlier. In fact, many of the charts brought back by Cook had actually been drawn by Bligh, who received no credit for his cartography. Remarkably, 12 years after the fact, he was able to call up from memory the latitudes of key locations, and with his sextant, he could reach those latitudes. But for longitude, east-west, he had to rely upon dead reckoning, meaning intelligent and informed guesswork. They sailed west through the Fiji Islands, inside the Great Barrier Reef, and through the Torres and Endeavour Straits, between Australia and New Guinea, toward the island of Timor. As they threaded their way through many islands, starving and with their survival very much in doubt, Bligh, the consummate Royal Navy officer, occupied himself by making charts of the area. Food became an overwhelming obsession. From day one, Bligh recognized that their meager supplies must be hoarded and stretched to the absolute limit. He calculated that it might take 56 days to reach the Dutch settlement of Kupang on the island of Timor, and so he got the men to agree to an allowance of about 2/3 of an ounce of hardtack per day, along with 4 ounces of fluid. When I checked our pantry, I found that I was fresh out of hardtack. But this heel of bread weighs 2/3 of an ounce, and the liquid is 4 ounces. This is the ration for 24 hours. When they arrived in Timor, they still had rations, however meager, for another 11 days. Bligh made a scale out of 2 halves of a coconut shell, and in one side he placed a single lead round shot found in the bottom of the boat, which he counted as 2/3 of an ounce, and so he measured out each man's ration. In the coming weeks, hunger became the overwhelming focus in each man's mind. As hunger became more severe and they passed near lush green Fiji Islands, 18 pairs of starving eyes begged Bligh to land and search for food. But showing a backbone of iron, Bligh steadfastly refused their plea because he knew they were likely to be attacked and killed by the natives. The crew were repeatedly ready to make poor decisions, such as wanting to consume too much of the limited food supply early on. But Bligh always saved them from themselves. They managed to catch only 1 fish, but they lost it while they were trying to get it into the boat. But once inside the Great Barrier Reef, they were able to gather some oysters and mussels, and 3 times they were able to capture a bird called a blue-footed booby. Not a morsel was wasted, including the entrails and the contents of the stomach, which were flying fish and squid. I'm sure it was a tasty meal, but perhaps not the taste you would prefer. And Bligh ensured that the blood was given to the weakest man. When the launch reached Kupang and the men were mere skeletons, barely alive, Bligh had accomplished an impossible voyage. Few people could have succeeded in doing what he did. Bligh deserves full credit for one of the world's greatest small boat voyages. Every one of those 18 survivors owed his life to Bligh's knowledge, skills, and leadership, but not one acknowledged their debt, and Bligh always resented that. In fact, he called the men he had saved a bunch of scoundrels. Although the Dutch governor of Kupang was ill and died a few weeks later, he offered every possible assistance: food, shelter, clothing, and medical attention. The crew spent about a month recuperating under his care, but Nelson, the gardener responsible for the breadfruit, died of fever. Bligh was dedicated to getting back to England and was able to purchase a 34-foot schooner he named Resource, in which he again set sail with his crew for another 1,600 miles to reach the much larger port of Batavia, present-day Jakarta, the local headquarters for the Dutch East India Company. So Bligh had sailed over 5,200 miles in 2 small boats since leaving the Bounty. At Batavia, Bligh found a Dutch ship to carry him to Cape Town, from which he was able to obtain passage on another Dutch ship back to England. He was back in England 2 years and 3 months from the beginning of his voyage. Fletcher Christian had an older brother named Edward, who was a celebrated barrister, and when the story of the mutiny became known, he frantically took steps to blacken Bligh's name in order to justify Fletcher's actions and salvage the name of Christian. In fact, most of Bligh's unsavory reputation can be traced to the successful efforts of Edward Christian. The Admiralty convened a court-martial which resulted in Bligh being completely absolved of responsibility for the loss of the Bounty. The Admiralty sent a ship, HMS Pandora, to the Pacific to capture the mutineers, 14 of whom they ultimately found. But when the ship was headed back toward England, it struck the Great Barrier Reef and sank, with the loss of 31 of her crew and 4 mutineers. 10 mutineers eventually reached England to be tried as pirates, 4 of whom were acquitted, 3 were hanged, 2 were pardoned, and 1 was freed on a technicality. Bligh was promoted to post captain and went on to a long and distinguished naval career. In April 1791, he was given command of HMS Providence, and in company with HMS Assistant, Bligh went back to Tahiti to complete his assignment to deliver the breadfruit to the West Indies. Ironically, after all this expense, time, effort, events, and deaths, the slaves refused to eat it. But today, if you are so inclined, you can find and eat breadfruit in the West Indies that was imported from Tahiti by Captain Bligh. After the second breadfruit voyage, Bligh went on to serve as commanding officer of several large naval warships. In HMS Director, a 64-gun ship, Bligh experienced his second mutiny in 1797 in what is called the Nore Mutiny. But this really had nothing to do with Bligh personally, but could more accurately be called a work stoppage by sailors throughout the Royal Navy in protest of poor working conditions and miserably low pay. With Director in the Battle of Camperdown against the Dutch fleet, I fought 3 Dutch vessels and managed to capture the flagship and its vice-admiral, and for this the Admiralty awarded Bligh a gold medal. And in 1801, Bligh served under Admiral Lord Nelson at the Battle of Copenhagen in command of HMS Glatten, where he performed so well that following the battle, Nelson invited Bligh to come to the flagship and personally congratulated him on the quarterdeck, a rare honor. In 1805, Bligh's old friend, Sir Joseph Banks, who had recommended Bligh for the breadfruit voyages, recommended Bligh to become the governor of the penal colony of New South Wales, where in 1806 Bligh would endure his third mutiny in what was called the Rum Rebellion. A military group called the New South Wales Corps had put together a completely illegal but highly profitable illicit trade in rum, and Bligh had orders to dismantle it. He did just that, and, of course, incurred the wrath of all the beneficiaries, who arranged for soldiers to arrest him, after which they established a military government and held Bligh prisoner for the next 2 years. The British government later declared the rebellion illegal, and the officers who led it were cashiered out of the military, and Bligh returned to England and the Navy. At this time, the Royal Navy was organized into 3 fleets, labeled blue, white, and red in ascending seniority. In 1811, Bligh was promoted to Rear Admiral of the Blue, and in 1812 he became Rear Admiral of the White, and in 1813 he became Rear Admiral of the Red, followed in 1814 by becoming Vice Admiral of the Blue. This was a remarkably rapid rise through the ranks to a very senior position, indicating that the Admiralty continued to hold Bligh in high regard. Bligh died of cancer in 1817 at age 64, and he was buried in London in the churchyard of St. Mary's at the foot of Lambeth Bridge on the south bank of the Thames, within walking distance of his home. The church was later deconsecrated and became the Tradescant Museum of Garden History, and I have personally visited Bligh's monument to pay my respects to a great navigator, a great seaman, and when the chips were down and it really mattered, a great leader. His monument reads, "To the memory of William Bligh, Esquire, Vice Admiral of the Blue, the celebrated navigator who first transplanted the breadfruit tree from Otaheite to the West Indies, bravely fought the battles of his country, and died beloved, respected, and lamented on the 7th day of December, 1817, age 64. It's both curious and disappointing that there is no mention whatever of his greatest achievement, which was the impossible voyage in the Bounty launch. You have to admit that the man lived a full, challenging, and interesting life. Thank you.